Today I'm going to tell you about a show from the early 2010s that was marketed to kids. It was about an angry little man with a cruddy life and a bad temper that made him swear revenge on everything in the world. And it was somehow pretty good. Dan vs. is one of those weird little success stories of the past 2 decades. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing most 6-year-olds would be into, but there it was, right alongside Littlest Pet Shop 2012. And it developed a cult following in its time. That following has waned since it ended. Being off the air for 9 years will do that to you. But it's really interesting how something like this managed to garner the right audience in such a sanitized environment. I really want to know, how on earth did Dan vs. work? It was created by 2 aspiring writers at some point in the 2000s, Dan Mandel and Chris Pearson, relative unknowns who had a shared idea to make a show about themselves. Extremely negatively depicted versions of themselves. They initially pitched a live-action sitcom aimed at adults, but later reworked their idea into an animated series, citing more creative possibilities. They were interested in selling it to Adult Swim specifically, but were then approached by Margaret Loesch, a CEO of Marvel Productions in the 80s and Fox Kids in the 90s, who was about to run a new channel to be a joint venture between Discovery Communications and Hasbro. She thought this Angry Dan pitch would be a great fit for the hub, which would mostly start off with Hasbro propaganda and Grossology reruns. It was a pretty strange journey from adult sitcom to animated kids show with more or less the same premise, but since Loesch was one of the people responsible for localizing Power Rangers to the US, they must have been convinced she'd make it work somehow. What initially gave the show a little push in advertising was that they'd market it as being animated by some of the people behind The Simpsons and King of the Hill. Not that Dan Mandel or Chris Pearson ever worked on either show, as far as I know. They just meant it was brought to life by the same animation studio, Film Roman. In that case, why not say it was made by the folks behind Garfield and Friends too, but I digress. Dan vs. premiered on January 1st, 2011, and was usually broadcast in evening slots in the hopes it attracted an older audience than the shows that were the actual reason the hub was launched. Its critical reception was mixed to positive, but it soon became the network's second most popular show with adults, distantly following My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, of course. As a matter of fact, there was quite an overlap between bronies and Dan vs. viewers in the fandom's early days. So I guess opposites attract. It was sure to be remembered by some people long after it was over now, and sadly, its day came only 2 years after premiering on March 9th, 2013. Film Roman were able to produce 53 episodes in that time across 3 seasons, so viewers had plenty to watch while they could. But Dan's voice actor, Curtis Armstrong, later stated on Facebook that the show was cancelled randomly one day, and he wasn't given an answer as to why for months after its last episode aired. If I had to guess why it ended so soon, it wouldn't be because demographics didn't line up, but due to the nature of the hub. Part of the reason it was launched was to advertise Hasbro's new toy lines through cartoons, and I couldn't see them making Dan vs. action figures. This is just speculation though, it could be because of demographic issues or any number of reasons. Hopefully, if the show ever comes back, the first episode will have Dan take his revenge out on whoever got him cancelled.
Shut up! What are you, stupid? I said shut up! Okay, bye, Grandma.
Meet Dan, a misanthrope in every sense of the word. He's only got 2 reluctant friends and a hatred for the rest of humanity. Pretty much any time something pisses him off in less than a minute, he vows revenge and plans to attack that at the source. These can range from an annoying person like a ninja, to massive institutions like baseball and art, and even entire states and countries. While sitcom-esque in tone and humor, becoming an animated series opened up a lot of possibilities for the writers to do whatever they could think up. Sky's the limit for how angry Dan can get and what he can fight against. With a concept as cynical as this, however, a hateful person taking his rage out on an equally hateful and stupid world, they had to make damn sure the characters were fun to watch. Not necessarily lovable, but entertaining to see get into these wacky situations, and it's a good thing the characters ended up being the show's strongest draw, in my opinion. Dan is obviously not a conventionally likable character. He has every flaw in the book. but they made sure it was just fun to watch him do things, struggle through life, make elaborate plans, share his cynical worldview with others. He's still pretty charismatic, and you tend to feel sorry for him given his childhood is implied to have been awful, so you will be able to find a little humanity in him, just enough to care about his motivations and adventures. Chris is an old friend of his, and mostly hangs out with him either out of pity or because he can be useful. He's an appropriate partner in crime, being far less flawed but still prone to shenanigans. His biggest vice is gluttony, but you wouldn't know it from looking at him. Chris's wife Elise is also a major component of the show, being a quasi-government secret agent, often going on missions that intersect with Dan's plots. Despite this, she still makes for a great addition to the dynamic, having a more serious personality, but being more inherently surreal. How much you like her can depend on the season. There are some times in the middle where she starts to overtake the spotlight, but I didn't really mind since she stayed an interesting character. Early in the show, Dan adopts a cat named Mr. Mumbles, who hasn't got the biggest personality, but she's cute and gives him something to be happy about. I really think she was an important addition, humanizing Dan a bit, so she's got more importance than most pet characters on TV. Elise's parents, Don and Elise Sr., slowly become a recurring duo, providing awkward jokes at least, and their own malicious double lives at most. They can work as either villains or a comically awkward presence pretty well, but I prefer seeing them in more mundane situations. Perhaps the most omnipresent supporting character is Crunchy, this spaced-out hippie who always turns up in different occupations. It's great how his mellow temperament always works as a contrast to Dan's, and Tom Kenny nails the performance. He's one of those voice actors where you can always tell it's him. I mean, Crunchy basically sounds like Spyro on weed, but he never phones it in. The regular cast is minimal, but they all fit snugly into their roles.
I don't know why he's upset. Usually when someone tells Dan they'll see him in court, they mean as a defendant.
I think the key to Dan Verse's biggest successes mostly comes down to the writing. It's honestly pretty clever for the most part. While world building wasn't necessarily top priority, the setting was at least a smart choice. Los Angeles is a big place with a lot of industries, so there's a lot of things Dan can fight against and a lot of wacky people, generally archetypical of greedy or inconvenient businesses. I'm not saying LA's a terrible place to live in with terrible people, I wouldn't know, but it's a large and busy enough place for a curmudgeon-y shut-in like Dan to always have something to be upset about. It was also a very good idea for them to turn it into an animated show when they did, because although the characters were mostly designed for a sitcom, that just makes it more fun to see them go on those bigger adventures. Stuff like burying Canada in snow or fighting hippie Steve Jobs were easier adventures to bring to life. I'm not saying the animation is the best, it doesn't try to hide the fact that it's Flash, but for Flash in the early 2010s, it's got enough detail and personality to stay an entrancing watch. I really like the grimy textures, no matter the setting. They really get you into Dan's mind in a way. There's also something in them that tells you that this show isn't exactly designed with just kids in mind. It was wiser the hub to mostly air it in late afternoon and evening slots and slap it with a PG rating, because Dan shouldn't really be an unattended 5-year-old's role model, and there is some blood and adult themes scattered throughout the early episodes, even some jokes that are generally considered overboard for The Simpsons. Not saying this makes the show inappropriate for kids, it's just got an edge to it. Part of me wonders how they would have fared on Fox or Comedy Central, but they've developed such sedentary styles that they likely would have shaped it into something different to fit their square pegs. I kind of like how this was a kids channel's attempt at an adult-oriented cartoon. It just makes it that much stranger of a beast.
I'm here about my face being all scratched.
Oh, don't worry. I'm not a doctor.
Season 1 is the most adult in terms of mature themes and content, but it still does a good job of establishing the characters and their goals. A few important events happen, like Dan meeting Mr. Mumbles in Dan vs. the Animal Shelter, Hortense the BurgerFile cashier in Dan vs. BurgerFile, and Elise's parents in Take a Wild Guess. Par for the course in animated shows by 2011, continuity plays a key part in the comedy, how these characters have been through life-changing experiences, but don't bother to learn from their mistakes. From the beginning, stories are built around who or what Dan has plans to annihilate today, and Season 1 generally preferred higher concepts with less of a personal grudge. Dan will hate the very concept of traffic, technology, or art, or go after establishments like ye old Shakespeare dinner theatre. It isn't until episode 14, Dan vs. the Barber, where the conflicts get more interpersonal. I'd say this was a smart move. Having most of the first 13 episodes be about how Dan plots is a good way to introduce the characters and formulas before getting focused on who Dan plots towards by the end. The reward being more personality throughout the cast as a whole, and the targets becoming less nebulous and more direct.
I am tired of programs, Elise. I want to see the world. I want to go skiing.
Okay.
The following season is generally considered the weakest by fans, and while I can see why, I don't think it's anywhere near bad. As Dan's targets became more direct and personal, I guess the writers had to start making Elise's B-plots bigger and wackier to make up for it. It created an imbalance in focus, as who was treated like the real main character changed from episode to episode. I never really minded Elise, but if you enjoy Dan's adventures a lot more or prefer Elise being a side character, I can see why this direction would throw you off. I guess they realized this halfway through the season because towards the end, they either threw Dan into Elise's situations more often, or just gave him wackier stories again, like a robot invasion at the Gaim or befriending a dinosaur. I guess to throw him a bone or bring the show back on topic, but either way, I think the quality of season 2 picked up again as it went on. While the year's overall attempts at expanding on the first were a bit mixed, some pretty solid expansions and others that rightfully stopped dead in their tracks, I still think they put out a good lineup, given it was a little shorter and people now had expectations for the show.
Speaking of cavemen, I'm going on a cruise.
I try not to let my bias for season 3s color my perception of every show, but man, season 3 of Dan vs. gets off to a very strong start, and that momentum just keeps chugging and chugging. Tons of good ideas, tons of great character interactions, and the comedy's sharper than ever. But it's the shortest of the bunch, only getting 13 episodes, and admittedly the last two, Dan vs. the Family Cruise and Summer Camp, left a bittersweet taste. That they were getting more experimental now, putting the characters in more dangerous situations again, and making their first flashback episode, but I don't think I've ever seen this phenomenon, a show hitting phase 2, getting more into the nooks and crannies of the characters, right as they're cancelled. A lot of potential opened up at the tail end that was left half-baked. Maybe the switch to early afternoon premieres tanked their ratings, or the hub started putting way more focus on their toy-based shows and acquired retro programming. Maybe Dan just didn't survive the infamous GAC attack of November 2012. Whatever the case, 3 seasons isn't a bad run, and 53 half hours is still a longer run than shows like Rocko's Modern Life, The Proud Family, and Sonic Boom, but this is the sort of show that could have reached season 5 without getting stale. I'm grateful all 3 seasons ended up being a different flavor of good, because they've each got some classics as well as some interesting episodes. The Imposter is about a man who claims to be Dan and steals his life from him, so the only way the real Dan could get back at him is by letting him know that his life is miserable. All those years of bad behavior seem to have paid off somehow. The Mummy was a lock simply because of my love of Egyptian mythology, but Seth Green's interpretation of a mooching undead king made it so much funnier. Everyone's on top form here really, and the story just inherently has some intrigue to it. The dinosaur is another one of their more out there concepts, and I'd say they executed it pretty well. Of course Dan would hate it at first but grow to love it, and of course he'd cause problems for LA in spite of and because of that, it's only natural. The Telemarketer was as good of a sequel to the Imposter episode as I wanted. It takes a while for the mystery to build up, but then it hits you with a bunch of weird, creepy concepts. This lookalike really means business for someone who wants to impersonate Dan of all people, and I wonder how these episodes would have progressed had the show gone on longer. George Washington is the cause of one of Dan's most esoteric injustices, but it still makes for a funny episode, proving that he can get mad at pretty much anything, and that the ways he'll try to get back at a person who's been dead for 200 years can still be creative. Anger management is such a great place to take Dan, but also true to life in a twisted way. His instructor Amber has a bunch of repressed anger, and Dan starts to teach her how to let it out in unhealthy ways. It's a good way to give the setting some legs, and by the end, it becomes very clear how much rage is too much, even for Dan. My favorite episode would have to be Dan vs. Art, a cynic's look into the current day art world. Postmodernism and post-postmodernism are given a harsh call out here, as is an industry that's no longer satisfied with just making appealing or accessible pieces. It's not a highbrow episode, it makes fun of the highbrow, and that's what I like about it. As for some of my least favorite episodes, the family camping trip involves Elise's parents trying to bring her back together with her ex, Colby. When I said her parents are at their best when they're more normal, this is not what I meant. This is a pretty lame sitcom plot for the most part. The wedding is one of the less appealing love stories. Hortense, the cashier from a while ago, is getting married to the CEO of BurgerFile, and a bunch of wedding cliches commence. I'm fine with Dan's relationship with her ending on a sour note, how could it not? I just hoped the story would be less hokey somehow. Traffic is a really early one that's not very funny or interesting and was surpassed by almost everything else. The fight at the end was ambitious for this early on, and Henry Winkler being there was neat, but that's about it. My least favorite would have to be Dan versus Dancing, mostly for how aggressively Elise is characterized. I feel like the main trio was usually pretty balanced, but here when they make Elise just as mean and violent as Dan, it just makes me feel miserable for Chris. Not a fun time, but far from terrible too, just very imbalanced. Plus the humor in the title is lost on my accent. This show isn't Dan versus, it's Dan versus, and it's a unique little gem for what it is. You really start to relate to the characters after a while, and the jokes are usually creative and sometimes even downright hilarious. It's a miracle it was even made at all, and while Dan Mandel and Chris Pearson haven't been super busy since it ended, they've left behind a more positive legacy on animation than negative, ironically enough considering the nature of their show. But I know what you're all thinking, why are you playing The Simpsons Hit and Run music? Well, this is actually the credits theme for Dan Versus. It's a great listen. Goodbye for now.
We'll be right back with Johnny Bravo.
My car! Bedazzled.